Every day we get hundreds of questions from our audience across the country about coronavirus, the vaccine and what the future looks like. Today we're going to look at a few of our most asked questions and get the answers from experts we've spoken to throughout the week. The first one is about immunity and booster shots. How long are you protected for after being fully vaccinated? Epidemiologist from the University of New South Wales, Mary-Louise McLaws, explains.
There's been a very good study looking at neutralising antibodies by Miles Davenport from the University of New South Wales. And his study shows that about the high vaccine efficacy of, say, Pfizer, you're protected by about 8 months. And then for a slightly lower efficacy of AstraZeneca, by about 6 months you need a booster. And in fact, that's been played out very accurately in Israel, where they started to see breakthrough infections. And they were in, of course, people that had 2 doses and sometimes none, but in the elderly. And now Israel's rolled out a booster shot, and they started from the elderly because they were vaccinated back in December. So they started to lose their protection. And now they're up to about the 50 years of age group. And we will now start to have to think about vaccinating our elderly in about October, again with a booster.
We hear a lot about vaccines, but what treatment is there for people who get COVID and end up in hospital? And what sort of drugs are available to them? Infectious diseases expert Dr. Nick Coatsworth is a former Deputy Chief Medical Officer, and he answered that for us.
We're learning more and more in the past 18 months about how to effectively treat COVID-19. One of the mainstays of treatment is a really simple drug called dexamethasone. It's a steroid, and accompanied with some of the newer drugs. The idea is that you're switching off the inflammation, because it's not actually the virus, it's the inflammatory response that tries to clear the virus from the body that causes so much lung damage and puts people into respiratory failure. So you come into hospital, you get oxygen, and pretty much as soon as you're getting the oxygen, you're getting the steroid, you're getting the other newer anti-inflammatory agents. And there is a new drug now called sotrovimab, which has just come into the National Medical Stockpile, which is also a welcome addition to our COVID-19 treatment and is usually used for patients who are at risk of getting into hospital and intensive care, but who may benefit from early treatment. And that's been distributed around the country this week.
From treatments that work to those that don't. This week, a Sydney man who had been infected with coronavirus overdosed on an unproven COVID treatment. What is Ivamectin? Brendan Crabb from the Burnet Institute explains.
Ivamectin, the drug in question, is a fabulous antiparasitic drug, both for animals and humans. But of course, COVID is caused by a virus that's very different to a parasite. This antiparasitic drug does not work against the virus. What happened in the early days of COVID was a lot of existing drugs for all sorts of things were tested against the virus. And a few of them, hydroxychloroquine was a famous one, ivermectin was another, took off in folklore rather than in reality as effective. And of course, that hasn't stood up against any formal clinical trial. They're not effective against COVID. Either hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin. They're dangerous to take in the wrong doses anyway. So please avoid them. Vaccines are, at the moment, our exit plan. This is the way to get protected. You know, even in Victoria, in the small number of cases we're seeing in hospitals at the moment, they're nearly all in people who are unvaccinated. It's incredibly powerful, the tool of vaccination. Ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine simply do not work.
Another common question is about long COVID and whether you can get it once you're vaccinated. Here's Mary-Louise McLaws again.
It's probably less likely. Long COVID is more likely with hospitalised patients because they've got very severe infection. However, that could be due to what we call bias, follow-up bias, where most hospitalised patients are followed up much better than non-hospitalised patients. So I'll just remind you that in the UK, little kids are getting long COVID, and there's over 3,000 kids who are members of long COVID kids. And so it's not always those that are hospitalised, but if you get an infection after being vaccinated with one dose or potentially two, it's more likely you'll have a milder infection.
And if you were to have long COVID, could your symptoms ease if you then have a vaccination?
Well, that's interesting because that's what they're starting to look at, is that impact of vaccination as well. So it's a real world learning experiment, and it looks like that could be the case.
The importance of getting vaccinated has been laid bare this week as infections soar on the East Coast. One of the biggest questions the ABC receives is how quickly Australia could get to the vaccine target set by National Cabinet to trigger the next phase in the COVID response. ABC analyst Casey Briggs crunches the numbers.
This is one of the most common questions I'm getting now, that our freedoms are explicitly tied to vaccination targets, and it's the way out of the lockdowns that so many Australians are still living through. When are we going to get to these vaccine targets? These are Thursday's vaccine figures. They're increasing by up to a percentage point each day, but about 3 in 5 Australians over 16 have now had their first dose of a vaccine. Of course, the pace has been varying pretty dramatically between states. New South Wales has cracked the 70% threshold on first doses. Victoria is just under 60%. On the current figures, you'd expect Victoria to get to 70% on first doses by about September 19 or 20. Now that might well speed up, more on that in a second. We've got the ACT on about 67%. They should hit first doses of 70% next week. Of course, that's just first doses. Phases B and C of the national plan, they're talking about the double dose vaccination rate. And so what we can consider once we get to first doses is how long does it take those first doses to become second doses? What's the interval between doses? And that does vary at the moment per state because different states are administering AstraZeneca and Pfizer on different intervals. In New South Wales at the moment, it's about maybe 36 days between first and second doses. In the other states, it's more like 45 to 55 days, depending on the state. But I think those intervals are going to come down as we start to get a flood of Pfizer coming into the country. And what we're seeing is, a bit of a levelling out at the moment, 277,000 doses on average going into arms. But now we have the news that 4 million doses are coming from the United Kingdom in a dose swap. And that is going to boost the number of doses available in Australia to maybe as high as 10 million just this month. There are about 8 million people over 16 who are yet to get their first dose. So just doing some back of the envelope calculations, if, out of those 8 million, if half of them can get their first dose in September, would be up to 80% by the end of the month on first doses. So I think this pace is hopefully going to speed up quite dramatically in the coming weeks. That's the promise that extra doses bring us. We just need to see when they arrive and how quickly they can be put into people's arms.